Let's come to History 8, and we're continuing to follow the way a layer of dynamic occurs called history. And it's as if history flows over the top of the way in which consciousness flows. And it's very similar to the way in which experience flows over the flow of nature. So that nature founds for us, but does not found as a form, but founds as a energy in its pure dynamic. So that one of the first emergences from nature is time. Time is the first dimension. And when time emerges, naturally, it has no segments whatsoever. There was a very powerful French philosopher, Henri Bergson, in the early part of the 20th century, who called time a durée, a duration. And that this duration of time, before it has any kind of segments, is pure as a dynamic. And out of its pure dynamic, it generates space. And that in nature, space is pure and not at all a thing, not at all a form. And there are no forms, but that in that pureness of the time-space of nature, whatever emerges into existence does not yet really have what we would call classically form. It is a mixture of the little subatomic particles, not even subatomic particles, but the subparticles, the quarks that go to make up the atomic particles themselves. And they occur in something that is even more rarefied than a plasma. It isn't just that there are solids and liquids and gases, but there's also a plasma state of materia. But below that is a condition in the dynamic of nature that is before even a plasma. And there, all of the sub-atomic particles that occur as an undifferentiated unity that is still in its flow. We call this, in modern atomic physics, a Bose, B-O-S-E, a Bose-Einstein concentrate. And whatever atoms or whatever molecules made from those atoms occur in a Bose-Einstein concentrate, they all act together as if they were one. And when they act together as if they were one, this is the beginnings of existence, of existentiality, of objectivity, the beginnings of form. And it's only by raising the temperature of that time-space that you begin then to get an inverse of it, and you begin to get space-time that cinches itself in polarized electromagnetic ways to make matter, to make the parts, the particles of matter, to make the protons, the neutrons, the photons, the electrons, the gluons. All of these particles that then make something happen do so because the heat rises, and the heat is like an energizing. And out of this, you get the beginnings of what has been called for quite a long time thermodynamics, heat dynamics. So that nature now, by heating up, has literally brought objectivity into existence because time-space has been cinched in a polarizing way so that it is stable in space-time as things. But the stability is not static, but is iterative on such a large, quick scale that all matter vibrates. Atoms vibrate. Molecules vibrate. And so modern astrophysics can pick up the vibrations of any molecules and any atoms anywhere in the universe and can identify what those atoms are, what those molecules are. One of the leading astronomy journals just this past week had a photograph for the first time of a big planet orbiting another star about 200 light years away. And it was imaged by 4 great telescopes in Chile, the European Southern Observatory, and each one of those telescopes has an 8.2 meter lens scope, and all 4 work together and produce this monstrous, huge telescope that is able, first in the history of our kind, to image a planet around another star. And in that planet, that giant planet, they can tell from the light signature that there's water vapor, a lot of it, in the atmosphere of that huge planet about 5 times the size of Jupiter. We can detect different molecules, not just in stars and in planets, but in just gas, interstellar clouds, or even intergalactic clouds, and tell that in those clouds already, they're not just hydrogen, not just molecular hydrogen, which is H2, but there are already hydroxyls, there are molecules that are like ammonia or ethane, and that these hydrocarbons, which are the seeds of organic matter and life, along with water, exist in interstellar or even intergalactic space by itself. What we're trying to look at is that as experience flows over mysterious nature, on just the experience level, none of this detail is available. It's not apparent. Because experience for our kind is limited to the focus of accessibility of the electromagnetic spectrum, which is largely visible light, or audio sound, or the range of smell, or any of the senses. There was a period about 200 years ago that for the first time it occurred to a number of people, nearly all at the same time, that man is creative and can transform and can have more than 5 senses. And one of the first persons to make this case and to express it very poignantly was a man named Edmund Burke. And he presented everything in a book called The Philosophic Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful. And Burke was a lifelong friend of Benjamin Franklin. In fact, every time we look at some of these individuals at that time, about 200 years ago, there's Benjamin Franklin. He's either corresponding with them, or he is personally talking with them, and talking in such a way that he is encouraging all of them to come together in what we would call today interactive sets. And in fact, Franklin is the first person in that time period to master not only bringing people together for a creative, cooperative way of enlarging the senses of man, the numbers of them and the range of them, but that if you enlarge his sensory basis, his physiological, existential basis, and the experience then balloons out and extends its range, the mind will, in its natural integral, grow in sophistication, grow in the capacity to index and to focus, and the ideas that one gets out of these new ranges are new ideas. They were never thought before. And so one has a phenomenon of completely new ideas that are at once larger and more detailed. They're at once more penetrative and more communicative. The first group that Benjamin Franklin made, he made at the age of 21. He had been a runaway from Boston, from his older brother's printing business, and set himself up. And as soon as he went to Philadelphia and got going, he was offered a chance to go to London and buy some equipment. And while he was there, for the first time at 19, Benjamin Franklin saw that there were many people who were beginning to understand that there is a new person possible for the first time in the world. And what happened was that insight that a new person could come out reflected back on the original human beings who thought that they were new persons. And that was about 300 years before them in the Renaissance. And in the Renaissance, there was the confidence that something had changed in the world. Sir Kenneth Clarke, who did the 13-part series for BBC called Civilization, on how art is the core of developing civilization, says in, I think, the beginning of his series, he said, sometimes the world seems warmer. It's as if nature has turned up the heat. And in this hothouse, greenhouse effect, men and women become more creative than they were just before. That a couple of years ago, those same people were content just to live in this way, and now they're looking around, not discontented with life, but fascinated that there may be a whole new ways to live and to be with each other. And he said the Renaissance was that time period. And the heat that came in the Renaissance, as we have seen, was the heat of rediscovering antiquity. That there was power that had been lost in the intervening space, and for the first time people began to think of that intervening space between the power of classical world and the new found revival of powers in the Renaissance, that in between was a fallow period that they called the Middle Ages. It was just an in-between, just a middle. It wasn't anything except a kind of a transition that really wasn't that interesting compared to the interest now of a Renaissance and of a classical peak of human capacities. And so the Renaissance, in its joyous, youthful grabbing of reviving antiquity, did both a good and a bad and many middle things. They grabbed it all and did not understand that when you bring all of classical antiquity back into play, you bring all of their problems back into play, as well as their capacities. And so in the Renaissance, one had, yes, creative people, but one also had the rising sense that, well, we could revive the empire. Because at the height of the classical world was the Roman Empire, in its formulation, in its foundation, the Caesars. And so you began to have people at this time in the 1700s who said, we are a more sophisticated Renaissance. We're the Enlightenment. Those people in the Renaissance, they took the classical energies and brought all of these terrible things back into play. And while, yes, you'd had artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, but you had also writers like Machiavelli saying you have to understand the ways of power because that's how the world is. And to maintain your power, a Renaissance prince would have torture chambers, personal poison, pharmacology, people researching it, paid assassins, paid military people and armies, alliances with all kinds of other individuals trying to do this, and pretty soon you had this warring city-states phenomenon that was there at the beginnings of the classical era. It was there in the city-states of the Greek time. And all those city-states eventually became one city-state, Rome. And so the Renaissance, that had a revival of all of these city-states, eventually gave rise to the deep conviction that one could bring back a Roman Empire, but not Rome. This time, the empire would be one of the European countries that would take over, and eventually there was vying between less and less. The Spanish wanted the Spanish Empire. The British wanted a British Empire. The French a French Empire. And so there was this movement at this time for people to set up an empire, and eventually, early in the 1800s, the person who reemerged as the new Caesar was Napoleon, to make the French Empire permanent. We're going to take over everything. And Napoleon saw that you have to do two things at once. To establish the empire, you need to have military forces that are unbeatable, and they have to be unbeatable because they are held by a superior military strategy and by generals, and eventually there is only one person at the head, and he is the military dictator, and he's the one who makes it all go. And so he saw himself as that. And the second thing, one has to commandeer all of the historical energies and put them in your own parentheses, so that everything now that happened, you can say, led up to you, and the justification for it is that you are the one who has the power now. And so one of the first things that Napoleon did is not just to try to militarily conquer other countries in Europe, but he took an enormous expedition and went to conquer Egypt. Why Egypt? Because Egypt was the founding of Western civilization according to their time. And so Napoleon went to Egypt to take over the fundamental power, not just the pyramid power, but the power of the pyramid makers, and to co-opt that and bring that into the roots of his own empire. And almost succeeded. The difficulty is that even in the early days of Egypt 5,000 years ago, it was apparent the first person to set up all of the nomes of Egypt into a single empire, his name was Narmer or Menes, and he established the first dynasty. He established an empire. And right at that time, exactly at that time, there was a counterflow going on that was not interested in the empire of Egypt, but was interested in a civilization of human beings. So that empire and civilization are antithetical. They do not mix. They do not go together. An empire, to establish itself, must stop the development of civilization so that it doesn't outstrip the control of the authority of the empire. And right away in Egypt you find an end run by those who would like to make a civilization and not an empire, they said, well, fine, you can have an empire over the living, but we need to pay attention to what's going to happen to you after death. So let us develop the after death, the netherworld scenario. And plus, there is obviously a cosmos before we come into being, before we come into play. We better handle that as well. And there are also overworlds of different energies and beings. You better let us handle that too. And so they put the empire onto the plane surface of the land and said, yeah, you control there, but we control the stars above, the netherworld below, life before life, and life after life, after death. And so we control a cosmic sphere while you control the earth. So now you have an empire on earth and you have a civilization of the celestial sphere. And 5,000 years ago, that was repeated not only in Egypt, but in Samaria, in central Iran, in the Indus River Valley, in India, in China, in Southeast Asia, in the southern part of the British Isle, in many places in Africa, that one finds about 5,000 years ago, this beginning, not a dichotomy so much, but a movement between two kinds of people. One that want to have worldly power, power as in money, as in control, as in military empire building, and an alternative group, which are not just an antithetical group, but are after a larger and larger sphere of appreciating not just the universe, but the transforms of the universe, making a cosmos. And so you have people interested in political economy of empire or in a conscious transform of cosmology. Now, and constantly there were great moments of interface between these two kinds of people. In the third dynasty in Egypt, one of the most tough, mysterious pharaohs ever, named Zoser, had one of the most brilliant men who has ever lived, named Imhotep, who was not only the personal physician for Zoser, but was also his architect as well. And it was Imhotep who was the first person to ever build a true pyramid. And when Zoser tried to power himself over Imhotep, the result was he wanted a very grand pyramid, and it didn't work. It was going to collapse. And so Imhotep had to point out to him, this is not going to stand. And so to finish it, it had to be bent, and that's why there's the bent pyramid at Dashur in Egypt. Imhotep was the first person in the world about 4,500 years ago to say, we can work together, but you cannot dominate. Your empire cannot extend to the physical laws of matter, to the cosmic principles of the universe, to the really deep netherworld and overworld and all kinds of other world qualities. Those belong to us. And if you want our cooperation, you must let us work in our way, and we will let you work in your way. And so to show what he could do, the next pyramid that he built is called the Red Pyramid. It's the world's first perfect pyramid, built by the same man for the same man. This quality goes all the way through history, and it's like a braiding. But what is interesting is that history is a civilizing dynamic, which definitely has its prismatic origins in art. Not only art of like paintings and architecture, but the art of person making. The art of the spiritually conscious person is an art. And teaching how to become that way is an art. And teaching the transforms of language so that language now is not just oral in a mythic experience or thinkable in a symbolic language which the thought can be then written down, but that there's a third kind of language which is a visionary language. It's a visionary language that lifts the symbols off the page, not into the voice in experiential air, but lifts the words off the page into a space of consciousness that now extends the mind, so that the mind is not just limited to the brain. The mind now expands itself beyond the limitations of the physiological brain, because the experience has been completely enlarged and transformed. And so the brain comes to a threshold where its limitations are surpassed, gone beyond. And now you have a different kind of space, and you also have a different kind of time. Now you have a time that has an infinity, which is real, and not just that you can start counting from 1, but now you can count from 0, complete 0. And you can count indefinitely, unboundedly, into infinity. But the difficulty is that that kind of language in ancient times was called a magic language. The first language is the language of myth. The second is a language of symbols, but the third is a magic language. Mythic language will tell myths that have largely a natural correlate and a ritual basis and a symbolic index. And the symbolic language will be a thought capable of being written in symbols that indexes all of that. But a magic language does not tell myths, nor does it think ideas. It is capable now of something like fairy tales, which have a transform. A fairy tale always has a moment, a threshold, in which you cross over into a completely different range, a different scale. Or you have now the ability not just to have a social mythic story or a rhetorical form for symbolic thinking language, but now you have the capacity to have a visionary conscious poetic. That the language has shifted from a rhetorical form to a poetic dynamic that will engender a new form called poetry. And while the symbolic form in the 1700s, in the Enlightenment, in Benjamin Franklin's day, reached a perfection in a form called the essay. Let us have an essay. Or if you want to have an oral version of the essay, you would have a sermon or a disquisition later on. The secular version of the sermon was a disquisition. But the sermon was the oral version of the essay. And the whole purpose of those kinds of languages are that you should be able to repeat what you have been told accurately. The whole point of a sermon was not to give you an extempore, but to give you a highly programmatic. You could always tell at what stage of the sermon you were at. And there is now from Yale, the collected works of Jonathan Edwards, one of the greatest sermon givers of the 1700s. In one of the volumes, there's a whole look at the Puritan sermon of the 1700s is exemplified by Jonathan Edwards. And the notes that were taken by several of the people that listened to his sermons, and you could read the sermons either as Edwards wrote them or as the notes from the parishioners who heard it, because they were exactly cognate, almost mirror-like. You could reconstruct the sermon from the notes because they learned by that kind of instructive inculcation that the sermon had been reduced, because in ancient times, sermione and Latin came very close from the Greek hermeneia, which means interpretation. That a hermeneia, which is like hermetic, kind of talking together, a dialogue, was meant to awaken your juices, awaken your capacities, so that you could go through the transforms. But the reduction of it to a sermon which was only instruction that had to be repeated, or if it was in an essay style, it was an education where you had to repeat on a written exam what it was that you had read, and there had to be a very strong, high correlate between what you wrote and what you read. The same thing. Both these are reductions that are introduced for the protection of an empire, to keep people in their place. Everything must have a place, and everything must be in its place. And so that people are arranged and inculcated from birth into a social structure, by education into a categorized egg crate, and then all of this is sugar-coated by a social mythology that parades itself as if it were religious. And that all of this then guarantees that those who have control will keep control, and they will be able to count their chickens before they hatch, indeed, because they will control everything that happens, and everything that happens will be in a round, a dull round, which is predictable. And then they say, well, that very predictability means that we have achieved a science of empire. And all of this is bogus, all of this is incredulous, and all of this is vicious, both in reasoning and in effect on human beings. And what we have seen is that the Renaissance played itself out in both ways. It made empire more and more possible again, but it also made the esoteric cosmology of civilizing human beings more and more expanded. And Benjamin Franklin is an inheritor. He's born in 1706. He was born almost a century after Shakespeare wrote his last plays. And Shakespeare, though he died in 1616, he stopped writing about 1613. He saw the writing on the wall of the situation in England, and so he let it go. William Faulkner once said he had written his heart out and had seen the failure of the society of his time, and so he broke his pen and went home to retire. And he died at 52, probably of a broken heart. Because the English Renaissance came into a reduction down to absurdity with the accession of James II. When Queen Elizabeth died, even though she had her tyrannical aspects, she had made a renaissance in England, the English Renaissance, Elizabethan England. And when James II came in, he rode on her energies and her inheritance for a while, but it was James II who came out of Scotland. And there were many intelligent men and women in Scotland who did not like James II and what he represented, the empire turn that he was bringing into play. And those people in Scotland who objected to him on very strong grounds of, we have a wider sphere of understanding of life, and of all this. They used the term in Scottish for themselves. They called themselves Whigs. Whigs. And later on, when Scotland, through James II and everything else, became a part of the British Empire, there came to be a political party in the British Empire called the Whigs. And they're the founders of what became the Liberal Party in Britain today. The other party was the Tories that became the Conservatives. When Franklin went to London for a long stay in 1757, he took the founding of his junto in Philadelphia at 21, which he had expanded in Philadelphia to the founding of the American Philosophic Society, not just 8 or 10 young men, but a whole philosophic society that's going to have who knows how many people. It's still there. And then he went to London and took the same idea, and he had a group called the Honest Whigs that included some of the most powerful minds of the time. One of the people in Franklin's Honest Whigs was Edmund Burke. Another was the great Joseph Priestley, the discoverer of oxygen and about 10 other gases, and one of the founders of the science of chemistry. Between Priestley and Lavoisier in France, they made chemistry, just like Newton and Leibniz made calculus and modern physics. Franklin was right at the bridge between Newton and the founding of chemistry, and he made it possible because he linked them together. He was the founder of electricity. And in his lifetime, he was always referred to after that as Dr. Franklin. And Burke refers to him constantly with great respect, and he refers to him as Dr. Franklin. He says here, this is October 5th, 1775. Franklin is going home. He had been castigated by the British Empire Parliament. He wrote, "What say you to your friend and brother, philosopher Franklin, who at upwards of 70 years of age quits the study of the laws of nature in order to give laws to new commonwealths, and has crossed the Atlantic Ocean at that time of life, not to seek repose, but to plunge into the midst of the most laborious and most arduous affairs that ever were. Few things more extraordinary have happened in the history of mankind. These rebels of ours are a singular sort of people." What he realized, because Burke was a first-class intelligence, an A+ intelligence, he realized that Franklin was one of the greatest figures in world history. He was someone like Socrates, someone very cognate with Jesus. He was one of those fulcrums by which not just a whole age changes, but by which the nature of man changes. That this is an alchemy of not just an individual who has done this for themselves, and then has carried that transform into an enlargement, so he does it with groups of friends, but he extends that throughout by historical dynamic to future generations all over the planet. In the one, it is the person that has emerged, matured. In the other, it is the group of friends who mature. In the third, the double transform, it is mankind as a species who from now on will be permanently different from what they were. Franklin is that figure in our era of the world who made sure that all of the scales of these transformations were able to be enjoyed within a single lifetime. That one did not have to wait for thousands of years for some new improvement of man, but that it could happen within not just a single lifetime, but a single generation. His confidence was that he had restored the Renaissance vision of a new world, that instead of it just being a vision of a new world, now that new world had a historical energy and could be that. Let's take a break. Let's come back to something that is very rarefied. We're learning that the confusion of the civilized world has never been combed out, that the entanglement, confusion, goes back, and despite all of the efforts from time to time in the past, it was never combed out. So it's like having someone who has had snarls in their hair since they were a little girl. And now that they're mature and they would like to be mature and have nice coiffure, they have never learned to comb their hair. And so they are just rearranging the snarls by fluffing. And that's the state of history and civilization at the current moment. We have never had a combing out, though there have been eras when all of this has been tried as best they could. And it's only here in the 21st century that we have the capacity and the opportunity for the first time to do this, to run clear the problematic skews that have stopped us from enjoying what Benjamin Franklin called, he said there will be a society in the future called free and easy, which will include all of mankind. And there is this peculiarity that almost no one in history suffered more confusion about his work than Benjamin Franklin. This is from a couple of sentences from the introduction to an edition of Benjamin Franklin's memoirs. He called his autobiography his memoirs, by Max Ferrand. He was the head of the Huntington Library here in Pasadena in San Marino. And this was published by the University of California Press in 1949. Few, if any, documents of modern times have been subjected to such gross and persistent misrepresentation as has fallen to the lot of Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. This has been due primarily to the different times of its composition and to the unparalleled confusion attending its publication. Franklin wrote his memoirs, as he always referred to them, at 4 distinct periods. There's an interval of 13 years between the first and second part, then a lapse of 4 years more before the third, and the last part added just before he died, and is only a couple of pages. After his death, the publication of the autobiography was eagerly awaited, as its existence was widely known, but for nearly 30 years, the reading public had to content itself with French translations of the first and second parts, which were again translated from the French into other languages and even retranslated into English. When the authorized English publication finally appeared in 1818, 28 years after he died, it was not taken from the original manuscript, but from a copy, as was the preceding French version of the first part. And then there was a French translation in 1828. It seems incredible that 3 of the 4 parts of this great American classic should have been published first in French translations, yet such is the case. The complete autobiography was not printed in English from the original manuscript until 1868, 78 years after he died. And he died at age 84. 1868, he formed his first experiment in interpersonal community in 1727, so it was more than 140 years after that. Even under that, it was misprinted, misedited. And so for the first time in 1949, because the original manuscripts were at the Huntington, Ferrand went through them patiently and published the first real presentation of Franklin's autobiography, almost 250 years after he was born. And it wasn't until this edition by J.A. Leo LeMay and Paul Zoll that was first published in 1986. 280 years after he was born is the first time that it was combed through all the originals and all the different editions. And what they discovered was that the confusion surrounding Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, his memoirs, is like a vignette of the confusion that civilization has suffered in human history. And no one has ever done a combed out edition of civilization for humanity. And that's what this education is about. It's going back through from the beginnings all the way back up to where we are and into the future and combing it out patiently and patiently. It's taken 40 years. And as you can see, there is almost in our time no ability to understand what is right before you. There is not a taste for veracity, nor is there the sense of the adventure of exploring into the real. And this is the true temperature of our times. It's not true that there are not millions of people on the planet, but who would attend to it, but they need to be alerted that it occurs, that it exists, that it's something that can be done. One of the problems, just in vignette, the first stereotype of Benjamin Franklin was that promulgated by his son. His son was at one time the governor of New Jersey, but he was a Tory, and he was one of the 60,000 people who left the United States during and right after the Revolution to go and live in England and be an English person, to be in the British Empire. And it was all of Franklin's papers that went to him, and he purposely delayed publishing them or anything, any edition, so that in this fallowness, what occurred was a popularization of certain excerpts of Franklin, emphasizing the plainness of his counseling on wealth, how to make wealth, so that he became, in the 19th century, a figure like a popular person, like a Napoleon Hill or somebody saying, this is the way to wealth. He's a materialist. He's a womanizer. He wasn't religious. And no wonder a lot of people just forgot about him. And in 1905, all of this came to a point in a classic book written by one of the founders of sociology, Max Weber, and it's called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. First edition, 1905, greatly revised and enlarged in 1920, and it is a classic in the early 20th century of identifying Franklin as the first real successful materialist was only after wealth and all kinds of reprehensible qualities to him. And Max Weber is one of the people. His own biography in the Modern Masters, they characterize him, Weber, though a great maker of social mythology, was primarily a scholar. You can see his tortured features and face. Max Weber, who was a member of both the Prussian Diet, that's the parliament in Prussia, and the imperial parliament, or Reichstag. In religion as in politics, Weber was always ambiguous. For all his concern with questions of faith and Christian charity, he was, as he put it, religiously unmusical. About political parties, he was positively slippery, and not one feels, merely from a desire to maintain an academic and poised objectivity. His doubts about the National Liberals are evident even when he was only 23, yet to the problem of German politics, he constantly brought national liberal attitudes so that, for example, he could support yet ambiguously criticize the National Liberals' acceptance of Bismarck's anti-socialist laws. Even in the sudden liberation of defeat from 1918 to 1920, the ambiguities in attitudes remain, even though Weber appears to be at the last politically committed as man and citizen. But all of this slides into studies now that look at the ideology of Max Weber and the way in which people like this constantly bedeviled the footsteps and the achievement and the life of people like Benjamin Franklin. So that he was constantly being put into a misrepresentation stereotype, which graded and filtered and reduced him down to a sub-caricature of the person, and reduced to an absurd figure who then represents the most crass, materialistic quality of a bygone time that keeps trying to reassert itself. It's like in the early 21st century, the same kind of process is being done to Thomas Jefferson. Shredding him, discrediting him, reducing him down, because these are not just figures or characters or individuals. They are charismatically prismatic, resonant individuals who make civilization and not empire. In order to sustain an empire, you have to discredit all of those who would threaten it by expanding it. And not just individuals, but events. There can be no manned space travel because manned exploration of space is out of the control of a world empire. You can't control them, what they will see, what they will say, because it will all be new, and they will be new. These qualities, while they were critical and crucial 5,000 years ago already, they were limited at the time to royal designs and wisdom sages who were rare. By the time that you get to the times of Jesus, they're already Roman Empire-wide and severe enough to require a complete redoing of the transforms from the individual limited mind to the prismatic spirit person who is able to see the cosmos in its infinite possible arrays. In the Renaissance, after that was all anesthetized and co-opted, the Roman Empire simply shifted from one mythology, but keeping the mythological tack in place reduced Jesus to a Roman Catholic Church indoctrination. The Renaissance rediscovered several different strains that exposed all of this. One great study in Renaissance thought is the classic, scholastic, and humanist strains. Paul Oscar Christeller, one of the world's greatest scholars on the Renaissance, one of the figures who brought Marsilio Ficino back into focus during the Second World War. He was a professor at Columbia, and his book on Marsilio Ficino for the first time, looking through, like Tolkien at the time, writing Lord of the Rings, looking through the catastrophe of Nazi Germany and seeing that this is through a mirror darkly, that this has happened before, but not quite with the nightmarish, demonic, pseudoscientific intensity that it was happening at that time. Christeller's biography of Ficino was the first ever written, and it was written in 1943 at about the time that the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos was beginning to develop the atomic bomb. All of these are not coincidences. These are events that are on a resonance. They're called Hermetic circles, but they're not circles. That's a reductive kind of language. They are the resonant sets of events and situations and developments that belong together, and the sets are not held by doctrines or ideas. The sets are held together by a harmonic strategy of consciousness that extends itself out into the cosmos. So if there is such a thing as taking human experience out of the world, one still has experience in the world, of course, but it is brought maturely through a transform into the art of the person who now not only has the experience of the world, but is able to transform the world. So their experience is enriched. And then that capacity is transformed again, a second time, through the historical prism. And it makes it possible then for one to have a science of understanding the ratios and relationalities. All of this is reduced to self-help groups that take a wedge here, an angle here. Do not ever use the entirety in its double transform, because this takes time. It can't be done in a weekend. It can't be done with just a technique or a couple of techniques. That kind of maturation is a maturation where one comes to like a third capacity of oneself, a Trismegistus capacity indeed. You have your character, which can become an individuality. But then you have your consciousness, which can become a spiritual person. And then you have your historical civilization, by which one can participate in a real cosmos. And so in a 1, 2, 3 infinity, the title of one of George Gamo's popular books on physics, 1, 2, 3 infinity, is a very true statement. As a young man, I was the head porter at Sequoia National Park in 1960, and George Gamo came in a little sports car convertible, red, a Porsche, I believe, with all of his nice leather matching luggage, and a very stylish young woman. And George was always happy when he was with stylish young women out and about, thinking about cosmic problems, and having a martini with just the right lady, and great friends to chat with. One of his closest friends was James D. Watson, and Watson wrote a book, Genes, Girls, and Gamo, to recount his adventures with George Gamo. It is the ability to count 1, 2, 3 ellipses, infinity, that gives us the third transform. But what Gamo left out is that the true quintessential wisdom counting is 0, arrow, 1, 2, 3, ellipsis, infinity. Without having the instant, spontaneous, unified wholeness, emergence from zeroness, the ellipsis does not lead to infinity, but curls itself back to a hidden undertow which the one will carry if it doesn't recognize its origins. If its origins are not recognized out of mysteriousness, it takes its own unity as the foundation of authority, and this is one of the secret triggers of empire. The empire, any empire, must have some one at its head. And then there needs to be an executive branch, extension of those who run the empire for that one person. So that the church runs the empire for a King of Kings who is designated then as that person. And of course, how can you challenge that? And the challenge comes, as Benjamin Franklin and his confreres already 200 years ago found, that if you re-emerge that one pristinely out of the mysteriousness of nature, you get a one that is also able to be expressed as a ratio of 1/1. That expression is still unity, but now it's in a ratioability. And so the Enlightenment said there is a rational understanding of man which forbids the emergence of tyrannies that lead to empire, and instead encourage a proportional understanding of one's unities. And as long as they're proportional, then anytime you bring anything else into play, you don't bring just whole ones into play. You don't just get 1 and 1 are 2 and 2 and 2 make 4, but you get ratios that allow for you to do algebraic developments. And as soon as you do that, the geometry of the plane becomes the trigonometry of a sphere, becomes the calculus of all of the infinitesimal variations that there are between 0 and 1 and between 1 and 0. And you get an integral and a differential calculus, which allows one now to take the geometry of a plane and the trigonometry of a sphere into the unbounded universe. And this is what Newton did and what Leibniz did 300 years ago. And what a figure like Franklin did was make a bridge by finding that the energy that powered that universe was electricity, the electromagnetic spectrum, and to find a way to make experiments beginning to deal with it. From Franklin and his achievement came a whole generation of people like Lavoisier and Priestley who challenged the entire ancient and medieval understanding that it isn't 4 elements, earth, air, water, and fire, even if you add ether as a 5th, but that there are universal unities that emerge out of the mystery of nature and emerge whole and are what they are. There is a hydrogen. There is an oxygen. There are elements that once one gets to elements, one understands that they arrange themselves in resonant sets. And that those resonant sets have definitely like a family or a class similarity. And that at the end of the table of elements, as arranged by Mendeleev, one finds a column, the 8th column, which are the noble gases, the inert gases. Helium, argon, neon, xenon, radon. And that these inert gases are like a zero column that allows for, mysteriously, the column of the one of the hydrogen to have emerged in the first place. But that they always work in a complementarity, but that the zeroness occurs to someone who is in the world only in a remembrance, only in a retrospective. One would not know about helium until one had hydrogen that had transformed. Hydrogen 1, helium 4. But they occupy the first layer of the periodic table of the elements. All of the other resonances now fill out all of the columns between number 5, lithium, that goes all the way then to neon. And then all of the other layers will fill out. And not only will they fill out, they will fill out in such a way that the arrangement cannot just be put into the 8 classes in the 6, 7 layers, but that future transforms of those elements on a realistic basis makes new elements that also extend the range of those layers and those families. We now have 114 elements, and when we get to 118, sometime in the next 7 or 8 years, as soon as the Large Hadron Collider comes online in CERN, headquarters in Switzerland, we will get up to 118, and that element will be again an inert gas that's in a transuranium, and it will have a very particular property to it. It will extend into the very far reaches of reality, of fleshing out a stable, zero, noble gas that never had ever appeared in nature before, at least on this planet. There may be other star systems scattered who will have done that as well. The aspect is, there is only 2 real vectors that come out of the energies: civilization or empire. And the one obviates the other. And so those who will make an empire will always sabotage anything that will lead to the opening of generating a civilization. And the first thing that generates a civilization is an education. It's the educator, it's the one who makes the new learning, that is the initial pioneer that begins the creative focusing, because the civilization is a historical process that can only be prismed by mature persons who achieved their conscious transformed maturity, leeching themselves away from the stereographed world into a new adventure, new eras. It is the art of the artist of one's personal life that makes the prismatic lens that generates the possibility of a real history. And so one has a very peculiar kind of thing. It is only when consciousness as a remembering visionary process is active that there can be anything like the spiritual person. And the remembering carries with it, at the same time, like a creative, imaginative flow that not only braid together, but they become synergized in such a way that they are tunable in their spiraling together, just like the double helix. So that conscious remembering and creative imagination are a double spiraling that occur together, and they have a curious ability. They not only spiral together and make a penetrative, tunable pair, but that also has a rotational angular momentum which allows for that penetration not only to be radiantly complex, but also to have a tunneling penetration quality. And literally, with conscious remembering and creative imagination, one can tunnel through any limitations in the world whatsoever. No matter how firm they have been made, no matter how strong they have been built, no matter how long they have been there, just like tunneling electrons can go through any kind of a barrier, any kind of a wall. One of the first times that this was realized in atomic physics was in April of 1932 in England, the Cavendish laboratory. A man named Cockcroft and a man associated with him, Watson, they were able to take a look, along with George Gamow, they were able to take a look at the way in which relatively low energy radiation in the right way can tunnel itself through and split the nucleus of the atom. And that this was a revelation because it's the first time that any kind of a radioactive transform was man-made. The whole 4.5 billion year history of the star system. And it was extraordinary because when you see a photograph of that, the laboratory looks exceedingly primitive, as if it were like some kind of B-movie version of a Frankenstein movie. The glass tube where the electric sparks get highly energized, and the little place where it registered was like a big crate, like a piano box crate, and huddled in there among the instruments was the man who first registered that what they had done was that they had made artificial radioactivity in the laboratory. And from exactly 1 year for a Hungarian genius named Leo Szilard to take out a patent on atomic fission. And later on, he would try to claim that he owned all of the atomic things in the world because he had a patent. But the true genius was Enrico Fermi, who understood this process, if expanded in its energizing vision, leads to an impossibly great release of energy. And the first time that he was able to effect that was in the most unlikely places on the planet. It was in Chicago, Illinois, on the outskirts of the University of Chicago. There's a football stadium there. And in one of the little cubicles under the football stadium is what they gave Fermi to work with, and that's where the first controlled reaction atomically took place. And that was only half a dozen years after Cockcroft and Gamow and those people did it in the Cavendish. It was only 4 years later that Oppenheimer started the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos. So in 10 years, one went from something impossibly science fiction-y, B or C science fiction movie set to the first national lab at Los Alamos. And yet, within a couple of years after that, it was Oppenheimer who first realized that this was being curled into the service of empire, not being allowed to resonate in the service of civilization. And so he organized, because he was a very good organizer, he organized a planetary population of people who understood these things, understood not only the math, but the civilized consequences of it, to present to those figures in the world who are responsible. Unfortunately, FDR was dead, and so the person responsible was Harry Truman, who didn't understand any of this, and deferred to certain people who were aides, Vannevar Bush, Senator Vandenberg from Michigan, James Forrestal, Secretary of Defense, Dean Acheson. And it was this group of empire builders who said to him, "This is not credible. This man is suspect." And just a few years later, Oppenheimer was brought in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee, the Atomic Energy Committee, and considered an untrusty enemy of the state. And they took away all of his clearances, all of his ability to participate. This was at one of the early apexes of the Cold War. Those Cold Warrior empire builders are the ones today forbidding manned space travel, forbidding educations like this to come out, forbidding everything possible on the planet that leads and opens. What is effective, as Franklin saw, was not so much a revolution. That was the response of the general climate of the time then and carried on ever since then. It isn't revolution. It is recalibration. And when one gets to know the unexpurgated Franklin, one realizes more and more that he cultivated the recalibration on every level all the time. One of the things that the Junto did is that they pooled all their books together to make a little book collection which they could read each other's books and then talk with each other on it. And within a short period of time, just a decade or so, they enlarged that until it became the first public library in the world. Not a palace library, not a library of somebody wealthy and noble, but a library that belonged to the population of people, to Philadelphia. And it wasn't long after that that you began to get not the idea of the library so much, but the transforming possibility of a public library by which people could educate themselves. Franklin never went to a university. He educated himself by reading out of the public library of borrowing books from friends. Very similar American figure later on did the very same thing, Abraham Lincoln. He didn't have a degree. He never went to college. But he read other people's books all the time. Jefferson, the same way, was constantly being lent books, and even though he went to a fine university, it was the ability of others to give him the understanding that a recalibration is a patient, lifelong expansion of the capacity to extend your consciousness indefinitely. There are no limitations to the refinement that you are, and that your isness is not static at all, but has 4 different dynamics in it: nature, experience, consciousness, and history, and 4 different qualities of form that make a huge diamond. You have an existence, you have a mind, you have a spiritual person who is an artist, and you have a cosmic reality. Not that you are cosmic or the cosmos is there for you. It's that you participate objectively in the actual cosmos and achieve then what we would today call reality. That reality is not only life without death, it is life beyond the range of the limitation of death or of the appearances that the mind often is taught to misconstrue. One of the most beautiful little films called The The World of Jefferson and Franklin was made by Charles and Ray Eames, a husband and wife team. And it was for an exhibit, The World of Franklin and Jefferson, the American Revolutionary Bicentennial Committee. And they developed a version of what used to be called the histomap. The original histomap was done like this in the 1940s, and this was in a linear way, so that you saw all the layers together. And what's interesting here is that you have the recalibration of not just Franklin and the context of the history of the time, but the parallel recalibration of Jefferson, which came later and extended beyond. And you see that the magnetism of Franklin allowed Jefferson to organize his recalibration just like something becoming magnetized, so that he had the same quality of laminar flow that Franklin did. And what Franklin hoped to extend out to many thousands of people around the world, Jefferson upped the energy. He said, we would like to see what happens when there are millions of free men and women, and whatever they will do, we want to gift them with this capacity. Next week, we take a look at two of the developments of history, Hegel and Hannah Arendt. Hegel, at the beginning of the 19th century, discovering that there is a spirit moving through the world that is the energy of history, and Hannah Arendt living through the era of philosophic genius and then Nazi and Soviet and 20th century nightmares, and coming out on the very high side of exquisite intelligence. And one of her great books came out in 1958, was called The Human Condition. It's been in print ever since. And in the foreword she says, now that we are going to have space travel, man must learn to be matured in an even larger scale than they ever had been told or taught before. This education, this learning, fulfills that. More next week.